So I have just a little bit of housekeeping. As you can see, I'm joined by my colleagues, Caitlin, Rebecca, and Christy, and we're all here to help you with any technical problems that you might have during this presentation. That includes the sound, the captioning, seeing the video, or CE certificates. If you need assistance, just drop any of us a line in the chat. We will be using the chat as well as the Q&A feature in this presentation, so we'd appreciate it if you would change your settings so your messages are going to everyone rather than just all panelists. And you can change this by opening your chat box and clicking on the drop-down menu above the text box. And if you'd like, you can please feel free to introduce yourselves there now. Let us know who you are and where you're from. You can use the Q&A feature to ask questions so they don't get lost in the chat, and you can find that towards the bottom of your screen. And live captioning, as you now know, is available for this webinar. To toggle the subtitles on or off, click the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen, and you can choose either show subtitle or hide subtitle. We also have an American Sign Language interpreter joining us, and you should see their video on the screen. So all attendees are expected to follow the PILLARS Code of Conduct, which is outlined in the conference program. To summarize, please treat all staff, event attendees, and speakers with respect. Those who are not adhering to the Code of Conduct will be asked to leave the webinar. All presentations in this conference will be recorded, and a link to the recording will be shared in the next few days. So please check your email for that link and keep an eye on the chat, because about 3/4 of the way through, we will drop a link there for the CE certificates. You will need to be attending the live broadcast to get that link. And if you want to share what you're learning on social media, you can follow the event by using the hashtag PILLARS2022. No, so that brings me to the end of the housekeeping, and it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Caitlin Kenney of Western New York Library Resources Council. She will be moderating this Q&A session with our special guest, Judy Heumann.
Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you for that introduction. I will introduce Judy now. And Judy is a lifelong advocate for the rights of disabled people. She contracted polio in 1949 in Brooklyn, New York, and began to use a wheelchair for her mobility. She was denied the right to attend school because she was considered a fire hazard at the age of 5. Her parents played a strong role in fighting for her rights as a child, but Judy soon determined that she, working in collaboration with other disabled people, had to play an advocacy role due to continuous discrimination. She is now an internationally recognized leader in the disability rights community, and she was also featured in the recent documentary Crip Camp. And Judy, I would also like to say on a personal note, it is thanks to your work and the work of other disability advocates that I had the opportunities I did in education while growing up. Thanks to 504 legislation and the passage of the ADA, I was mainstreamed in public school. I had an IEP, and I was able to receive the accommodations I needed to have a robust education. So thank you for that.
Thank your parents. Thank you very much.
We have a few questions for you that we would like to get started with, and we will also take questions from the audience towards the end of this session. But firstly, I would like to ask, after working on landmark victories that included enforcing 504 legislation and the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, what inspires you to keep moving forward with your advocacy work? You know, you didn't just say, stop, we're done now. You kept going.
Well, first of all, thanks so much for inviting me. I was really excited being a Brooklyn girl and a New York City, New York State person. I was really happy to learn about PILLARS, and I think libraries are so very important and librarians are so very important. So my hat's off to you, given everything that you're dealing with, which really over the last couple of years is soup to nuts. Not only dealing with COVID and the changes that produced in libraries, but also now I think an increasing repression around books that people feel I should be able to read or I should not be able to read. And, honestly, having a family that fled Germany during the Holocaust, and remembering Kristallnacht and the burning of books and the experiences of my family, we lost a lot of family in the Holocaust. It's quite frightening to me. And so as I'm reading things going on around the country, and I had mentioned this to Caitlin and Carolyn earlier, this issue is of grave concern to me. So in some way, the question that we ask ourselves is, how do we continue? Whether it's the work I'm doing in disability or the work that you're doing as librarians and people in related fields, I think many of us are doing this because we believe we make a difference. And our ultimate objective, I think also for me, is that the barriers that I face, both as a disabled person and as a disabled Jewish woman and as a woman and disabled Jewish person, these various characteristics of who I am. Also, there are many adversities that are coming forward, increasing anti-Semitism, issues around the Roe decision, on and on. So I am one person like most of you, but we do see our intersectionality. So I never could, what would be the end outside of no longer being on the earth? Is there a day when in my little neighborhood in Washington, D.C., some of the issues that go on our block, a new gym that opens up in a place that didn't previously have a step, that now has a step, or, another restaurant that opens up with outside tables that are not wheelchair accessible, or all these things that just happen. I mean, I could only look at this from my perspective, but, Caitlin, I'm much too much of a networker, and I like to talk to people. And I feel that films like Crip Camp and my book, Being Human, and the young adult version, Rolling Warrior, and all the other books that are coming out now, written by disabled people, our stories are pretty clear. We face various forms of discrimination. And I feel like I have a personal and moral responsibility, really, to continue to be engaged and give people support and help really navigate changes that we believe need to be made.
I relate to that. I also feel a moral responsibility besides a personal one as well. And you're right, new changes keep coming, new challenges keep coming. I know when we started transitioning to Zoom, that was really hard for me personally because subtitles were not automatically available on Zoom. So making that transition was hard. And now we have this symposium today with the subtitles. We also have ASL interpreters. So that's been really awesome to see the progress that we've made in just this one small way over the past couple of years.
But it's still not uniform enough. The captioning is still not accurate enough, and you really have to rely on having a live captioner to make sure that you really are going to get what is being said, especially if it's something which is important, when someone's giving a lecture or a movie, or you're in school or whatever it may be. And I think also Zoom has really allowed people to recognize, for example, that captioning is not just beneficial for people who are deaf or hard of hearing, but, for me, because microphones are so frequently not all equal, and some people will come through very clearly and others won't. So I'm very happy for it.
Me too. I still have to do a lot of filling in the blanks, but it helps. This little bit helps. I would like to go back to the movie Crip Camp for a minute. We watched it as part of our planning for this symposium. and we learned that Camp Jeanette closed decades ago. Has there ever been another organization like that? And is there a place where disabled children can go today and be with each other?
I mean, I think there are many camps around the country, and there are some camps for disabled kids. And then, I spoke yesterday with a South Carolina disabled youth group that's supported by a local Center for Independent Living as an example. And they came together for 3 days. Some of these programs come together for a week. And there are many different organizations where people with different types of disabilities can come together for a period of time, sometimes day programs, sometimes overnight. And I would say, one of the reasons why camps like Camp Jeanette existed was because we couldn't go to the regular camps because they either weren't accessible or the management didn't want us to be there, particularly those people with physical disabilities and intellectual disabilities and others. So now I think that there are camps. More of these camps are becoming accessible, but I think that the programs that are bringing like disabled youth and disabled college students together for a period of time are very important, because too often we as younger disabled people and people, who are acquiring disabilities when they're older are not really meeting people who they can develop relationships with and talk about various things, including emotions. How do you feel when, you're denied access because of whatever? I mean, I'm going through a couple things right now where I'm part of some new organizations. The organizations aren't new, but I'm newly involved with them. And I think it's pretty much the first time that they've ever dealt with someone who is a wheelchair user. And so they are learning as we're going. And it's helpful sometimes to be able to talk to somebody who's not involved and be able to say, have you ever had these experiences? And how do you talk to people about this? And, I want to be able to be participating, and I want them to understand that I can't unless they have captioning or an interpreter or whatever it may be. But it's so new to so many people that, they kind of get afraid, they get embarrassed, they don't know what to do. So I think it's, for me, really, the Camp Jeanette played such an important role, as you could see, because we spent a lot of time together. Many of us went there 4 weeks or 8 weeks, and we went there for multiple years. So we grew up together. And if we didn't have, most of us had physical disabilities, we likely would have been able, to get together more readily in our neighborhoods. But because we did, we couldn't take buses. We couldn't do many other things. Not because we couldn't, but the buses weren't accessible. So I think the camps played a very important role in helping us be able to recognize that we shouldn't be feeling badly or apologetic about really demanding change. And I think it very much fits in line with the civil rights movement and what the civil rights movement has been doing for, more than a century now, and really fighting for equality, getting people to be able to speak up and out about the adversity of slavery and the long-term impact in our communities is something that may be very painful for people to listen to and learn from. But in my view, we need to tell these stories. We as disabled people of color from different sexual orientations, etc., we need to be able to tell the stories actually first to ourselves. And I say that because, it's when you're experiencing something that you may define as discrimination, it can be difficult to process. Because I know when I was younger, a lot of what would be said is, well, they didn't mean it. They didn't know. And they didn't mean it and they didn't know doesn't mean that it doesn't have an adverse effect on you and me and others. So it's why I think so many of our laws are important, and why I think advertising them so people both with and without disabilities understand them is I've never supported they didn't mean it. Doesn't mean that they did mean it. But what I want people to know is there are changes that need to be made in order to enable me and millions of others to participate. And I think, quite frankly, that libraries over time have really been, a very important place where librarians understand the value of libraries. And I think over time, understand the importance of accessibility.
I agree with that. I think the community is very important, having that sense of community, especially at camp. I didn't go to a camp, but I did attend all deaf retreats in elementary school at a camp for disabled children in Western New York. It was usually a long weekend every year. And it was a really special and unique experience just being around other deaf children of varying deafness, and some signed, some didn't. And that experience is very important. And I think it really shaped me. And I see in the chat, we have a few people that shared some camps near them. Juliet Gordon-Lowe has session for Girl Scouts with Disabilities. Buckport has a camp that is now international. So it's important. And there are a lot of barriers that librarians face. We work with people of all types of abilities too. And it's something that is always on our mind. And I think that accessibility has an increased awareness as well in our library community. So it's really important to keep that in mind when you're working with different people, because you don't know who has a disability sometimes. And disability is unique in that anyone can be disabled at any time. It can happen whenever. So
I think, you know what? One of the reasons why libraries are so important, or one of the reasons, when librarians really understand what's available, like the National Library Services for blind and people with other forms of disabilities. The other day I was visiting with new friend's mother's son, and he has autism and also some dyslexia. And they were talking about reading with him, and he can read, but it's hard for him to read because of his dyslexia. And so, I was explaining, you need to become a part of the National Library Services, and they had never heard of it. And what to me was interesting is that this is a family of means, and they never heard of it, which means that in school, no one told them about it. And they probably didn't disclose, as you were just mentioning, not intentionally, but they didn't know that, talking books, and people are used to them now, but they don't necessarily, they link it to a car, or they link it to like a podcast, something they're listening to. But they don't also link it to, for people who have difficulty reading, the ability to hear it in many cases can help that person be able to stay connected to the written word in a way that they otherwise can't. But I think the ability for libraries to also in a more upfront way, possibly have information there, which is very, forward, if you have a disability, such as whatever, and you'd like to speak to a librarian to learn more about the services that we can provide you. I think those types of things would also be very important.
That's a great point, because I have noticed, and you probably have as well, when it comes to accommodation, it's on you to ask for them. It's never always offered. And I think some people don't always want to ask. They're tired of asking, or they're afraid to ask, or they feel embarrassed.
Or they're afraid of a no, and then, yeah.
Yeah, so being more upfront about what's available to the users and having that information front and center at the reference desk or the circulation desk may be helpful for people who are afraid to ask for it because they don't think it's going to be available, or for whatever reason. That's really important to meet people where they are instead of letting them come to you.
And I think it's important to, on a regular basis, when a public event is being held, to make sure that captioning, sign language interpreting is provided. If it's an open event where anybody can come in at any time. If it's an event where there's closed registration, then, asking people if they're going to need these accommodations is something you can do. But I always feel like the site being accessible and looking at issues around what accessibility is means that the word will get out in the community, that you don't have to make sure that you meet a deadline to say, I need this. Yeah. And I think people also, by having appropriate accommodations, which at some point we'd like not to even have a word to it, right? It's just like today, libraries are all supposed to be built accessibly because they're being used with federal money and state money, which also in many cases obligates above what the federal laws require. People just expect it. And I think that's what you want. And I want people to expect things like captioning, because as I was briefly mentioning earlier, I never used captioning. Like if I went to a meeting in an open space, I didn't ask for captioning. But now I've become very locked into captioning because of issues where the voices aren't all the same. People may have accents, and I really do want to hear and understand what people are saying instead of having to continually lean over to somebody and say, what did they say? And they'll say, I don't know. And so many people, aren't understanding what's being said, and could be with things like captioning. And I guess I want to make one other point, and that is, what I was speaking about a few minutes ago, where something could be, publicly shown, which would articulate if you have whatever. And it doesn't necessarily have to be an identified disability. But, in communities where you may have a larger immigrant population of adults who don't know what disability is, the kids may not have a disability, the kids may have a disability, and they don't know how to use the system. So, the library can be such an important place for people to gather information, and also for people who may see a sign which says, if you're having difficulty reading, you may want to listen to an audio book. And then, allowing people to learn more about the value of audiobooks and things of that nature, I think are important. It's normalizing these issues for all communities.
I agree with that. And we actually have a question in the chat that I think fits with what we're talking about right now. What could libraries of all types do on a day-to-day basis, for example, for outreach to ensure access to all patrons? And I think part of the answer is making sure your programming is accessible For example, if you're showing a movie in the library, put the subtitles on. Making sure that the space you're holding your activities in are accessible, making sure you have an area for autistic children to go if they're feeling overstimulated. Even simple things, just in terms of structure, making sure your shelves are wheelchair width. Some of them can be pretty narrow, and making sure that they're not stacked high, that the books are going to be within reach for people of all heights. Those are the little things, and people notice. It seems little, but people do notice, and like Judy said, they will talk, and we'll get out in the community.
I think additional things that you can do is just like you highlight books for different months, like for summer reading, trying to have, a book or two that is inclusive of disability, highlighting authors who are writing books. Now that you can bring people in on Zoom, like we're doing today, there are ways of doing that. I would also speak in the community to some of the organizations run by disabled individuals, like Centers for Independent Living, National Association of the Deaf, National Federation of the Blind, the American Council of the Blind, the learning disability organizations, but really talk with them and, maybe invite people in, or some way of sending a letter out or something where you could say, we'd like to know what more we could do to ensure that people in our community have access to the libraries. For me, when I was growing up, because I was born in the 40s, my mom went to the library a lot, but the library wasn't close enough to my house. And so, my mother would go and pick up books, and I would go sometimes. But at that point, I didn't have a motorized wheelchair, which meant it was really difficult for me to push my wheelchair. And honestly, I've never really explored and learned how to use libraries the way I would like to, because they were just too difficult. And it was something that nobody thought, like, oh, what would you like to learn about the library? I was in special ed segregated classes. We didn't learn about libraries. And then there was an expectation that you knew about them when I finally started going to integrated classes. And then, like at university, many times they weren't accessible because it was, before the laws were passed. I graduated from college in '69. So I think it's always, looking at helping people learn about what a library is, how to use the library, if you have questions, what the role of the librarian is. And even on things, Caitlin, like reaching a book, it kind of doesn't matter for me how high the shelves go, because I can't reach most of them, or they're too heavy. And so, if you see someone just saying, oh, if you need any assistance, let me know. And I'm sure many of you do this already. I'm sure that much of what we're discussing, many of you are with an, I do that, or, oh, that's a good idea. But, I don't know how many of you listening to this today, but I'm sure one of the reasons you're listening to this is because you're working in this area already, which is good. I mean, librarians have to be doing that to some degree.
Yes, and we've had some sessions too, again, talking about meeting people where they are and not having that expectation that they should already know about the libraries. Many people don't. And I want to emphasize your point about working with organizations that represent people with disabilities, whether they're specific or general. For example, our interpreters today are from the Western New York Deaf Access Services organization, which is located locally in Buffalo, New York, locally to me. And it was really important to me that we worked with an organization that not only served deaf people, but also was staffed by deaf people. Not the entire staff, but many deaf people work there. And they do a great service to the deaf community. And I think it's really important for libraries to work with organizations that have representatives from the communities that they're hoping to focus on and work with.
I want to also say that many people never think about becoming a librarian. And disabled people have historically, and still today, not necessarily seen people like Caitlin. And so seeing someone like yourself, a woman, a person of color, someone from other diverse communities in your library is very important, because it allows you to think, oh, maybe I can do that someday. And that's why I think, obviously, the issue of highlighting books, movies that are dealing with disability or not. But for example, as Caitlin was saying, if you have a film series, make sure to announce in advance all our films will be open captioned. And then that allows people to say, oh, I know so-and-so here, and he's hard of hearing, and he might like to see the movie, but he wouldn't go otherwise because he can't hear it. So there are all types of things. And these, senior villages that are being set up in communities to allow people to stay in their homes. I think all these things are important, and even learning about, library services that are now available online, so people can be ordering books. People who may have been readers and can't get out any longer because where they're living is not accessible to them, or they can't get to the library. But I think, one of the good sides about Zoom is that we get to have this discussion. One of the bad sides around Zoom is I can't see any of your faces. So I don't know if you're shaking yes, like, oh, good, interesting, or what the heck is she talking about? We do all this already. So I hope I'm saying some things that are a little bit aha and giving a little bit more information. But at the end of the day, I think we all want libraries to become a more central part of our communities. And in many places they are, for many reasons. Not necessarily in the beginning because people are coming in to read, but because of homelessness and bad weather and things of that nature.
And talking about material that are representative, someone asked if having a book in Braille or other items on permanent display out on the library floor for patrons to interact with, not books that people would check out from the library, but just something you have out that people can look at and ask questions about. Would that be a way to get others thinking about what they could do or learn about disabilities as well?
Yeah, I mean, you can have an exhibition on technology, which would allow you to have, and if you've got organizations in your community, they might have a brailler that they would lend. There's all different types of technology out there. And I would imagine some of your libraries might even have some of it. But certainly on the issue of, Braille and sign language, like the kids section in the library, it could be really exciting, to invite people to come in who can help people learn about Braille, what it is, what sign language is, what ramps are, various things, so that people understand not only what they are, but how they're used and what benefit they are. And yeah, I think definitely allowing people, one of the issues around Braille, which is really important, is that Braille is not being taught enough. There's a big concern in the blind community that children are not learning Braille. And whereas there's many different types of technology, it's just like most of us are able to take notes. And we're taking notes like on our iPhone, or old-fashioned people like me in my notebook. But people do take notes in notebooks, and they do put them in iPhones or other technology. So the issue of note-taking is very important. And if you don't know what iPhones and others have available, the speaking function and the reading back function, but still the ability to write yourself notes, I think, is very important. So definitely groups like the National Federation of the Blind have for many, many years been fighting on the issue to ensure that families understand the importance of their children learning Braille. Just like work of encouraging families who have deaf children for their deaf children to learn sign language. It is part of communication. Not everyone does, but like Caitlin, you didn't learn sign language when you were growing up, but now you're learning it. Why is that? Why did you decide you wanted to learn it?
I've always been interested. When I was a baby, when I was a child, sign language, how best to put this? Sign language was not encouraged really in the 80s and early 90s. It was preferred that deaf children learn how to speak. And that was the encouragement that my family received at the time, that I should learn to speak. And I actually am fine with that. Like, I don't feel, I missed out, but I am interested in sign, and it is a part of deaf culture that I didn't grow up with. And that was part of why I wanted to seek it out and learn more about it and learn how to use it. I think languages in general are so interesting, and I love that there's a language out there for deaf people specifically to communicate with each other.
Mm-hmm.
As I have some more questions for you, a little bit about advocacy. As librarians, we frequently communicate with legislators to advocate for library funding and support for programming and construction to upgrade our facilities and make them more accessible to the public. And you've done a lot of advocacy work yourself, and I know you've communicated a lot with legislators. Do you have methods that you suggest for communicating with legislators? Do you share speeches, or do you find personal stories work better? And how do you know you're talking to the right person, the right legislator that will support your efforts?
So there isn't one answer. And again, this would be a perfect question where I would now say, so who in the audience has ideas of things you've done? You'd raise your hand and I'd say, so-and-so, so-and-so, so. So maybe some of you can put some of this in the chat. What I'm gonna say is nothing unusual. I would say that I think learning about legislators who themselves or have family members who may be needing accommodations, or what we're still calling accommodations, learning about who they are, letting them understand what it is you're trying to do, and get them to be involved in helping to make these changes, I think can be very important. Working with local organizations who will be a part of the advocacy, I think is also important. So knowing your audience, knowing the people in your community who are the ones that are really talking to you about accessibility. And I think also in many cases, there's a lack of accessibility when the law likely requires it. So I think, I don't always like to have to be talking about the law and litigation, but the reality of the situation is frequently people are not listening to things that are obvious. I include legislators in this regard. Libraries are something that most members value. They've used them, they've brought their kids to them. It's a way that they have learned. And so I think, again, getting the disability community to be a part of that advocacy, but also, many disability groups, like in New York State, the Coalition for Centers for Independent Living, they represent over 30 groups across the state of New York. I don't know how many they have now, but more than 30. And these other organizations, gets them involved. There's this New York State ARC, you've got organizations run by deaf people and blind people and people with learning disabilities, et cetera. So I think, getting, maybe there are other librarians in addition to Caitlin who may have disabilities, or even looking at some of the universities. I think you have university libraries here involved too, right, in Pillar?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, so I would think that some universities like Syracuse University, NYU, I don't want to not include people in this. NTID might be a great school to look at because they are on a very inclusive campus, and the librarians there may have some really good suggestions about what they do and how they do it and how they've done it over the years. So obviously you've got a committee, that's working on statewide budgeting and ensuring that disability or accessibility for disabled people is something which is regularly there. I think it's important if you're going to be testifying or you're going to be having people go and write letters or visit people in the Capitol or wherever level of legislation you're working on, really intentionally getting disabled people meaningfully involved so they can be speaking with legislators, I think is very important.
I agree. I guess it's not so much about our personal stories, but finding out the personal stories of the legislators and working
I
with
think
them.
it's both.
Yes, you're right. It's both.
I mean, when you look at the fact that people losing their vision are people in their 50s, 60s, 70s, that's another group that, you've got senior centers in your communities. If you're working with your senior centers, if, seniors are coming into the libraries, helping them learn about things you were discussing earlier, how to get accessible materials, what isn't National Library Service for the Blind, and low vision and others, they haven't heard about it. So I think really looking at how to get the word out there and get people more involved. And again, younger people learning about things like this will mean that as they get older, or their mother or their father or their grandparents, whomever, they also, I remember when I was at the library and they were da 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 da.
Yeah, I think we have all heard the legislator stories of their fond memories of the library when they were younger, or that
Exactly.
librarian they had that was, they just remember.
Yeah.
This is a question more about working with students with disabilities. Do you have suggestions for how librarians might address or work with students with disabilities who are feeling frustrated about the lack of accommodation that might be provided by their schools, frustrated by their lack of access, sometimes even frustrated by their disabilities?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, helping people, including yourself, and maybe you already know this, but look at like ADA.gov, Americans with Disabilities Act.gov. It gives you, way more information than the average person would want. Knowing about organizations in your state, like in New York, in addition to the Centers for Independent Living, there are parent training information centers. And those parents, those PTIs are federally funded. I don't know how many they have in New York, but you may want to look at having sessions at the library for college students to learn about what is legally obligated. How do you, many kids and families don't realize that if you had an IEP or a 504 plan, that one of the reasons you don't want to let it lapse because you're embarrassed and you don't want to be, having your friends know that you have a 504 plan or an IEP is the value of it. Because when you have it and you use it at the university level, typically it means you don't have to go through any of these certification processes that some universities require, which I think is being challenged by some people now too, about the amount of money that people are having to pay out of pocket, which means many of them can't, in order to be determined to be dyslexic or to need extended time or whatever it may be for whatever the cause of your issues are. So I'm not saying that this is something for people who don't have disabilities, but as we know, many people who have disabilities have invisible disabilities. Some of them were identified at one point. They did let their identification lapse, and others in colleges and graduate schools is sometimes where people are being picked up who have things like learning disabilities or depression or anxiety or bipolar or other issues that are causing them to need things like extended time or a variety of things that students may need, and faculty for that matter, and staff. So, you know, looking, maybe you could have a week or a month in libraries around the state, which would focus on one or two aspects around disability. You know, maybe as students are applying to college, you know, there could be something that would be up about things you need to know. Basic things like when applying to a college, look at their disabled students office. What does their disabled students office offer? You know, what do you want to let them know? How do you communicate with them? Yeah, and I think being able to, I mean, New York's got some very good universities. University of Buffalo, Cornell, others, CUNY, that have been doing good work in the area of disability, and Columbia and others. So I'm not rating any of them, but I just know from my involvement with them and other friends of mine who are working there or students that, you know, they're more knowledgeable about disability than in some other places. So take the information like we were just discussing, you either in your family or in your job are seeing that students are complaining that they're not getting the supports that they need, and you understand that this is something that should be happening. Now, frequently what that means is that the students need to be armed with more information so they could go to the school, for example, and say, I need this. I've given you what I need in order to be given it, and I need it in a timely way. And if they're not going to get it, they need to understand what their rights are. Can they file a complaint with the university? Can they file a complaint with the Department of Education, OCR, on and on? People need to know what their rights are.
I agree. I think it's really important that librarians can, a big part of a librarian's role is that you have the ability to empower your students, empower your patrons, and arm them with that knowledge. And it's another aspect of providing resources before people even know they need it or ask for it. If there's all sorts of awareness weeks and months, so you could even do library programming centered on those weeks, for Deaf Awareness Week, Blind Awareness Week. This is Disability Pride Month, so there could be programming focused on that and helping students. It's in the middle of summer, so that's the perfect time to help students prepare for college.
Maybe I like that idea. And, you know, maybe it might be that you could, you know, have something up, which is if you're beginning to look for colleges and universities that you may wish to apply for, some thoughts about what you might be looking at. Check, you know, if you have a and it's not just disability, but you can integrate disability into it, because students are also always looking for loans or grants or various other ways to get support to pay for school. So it's part of a package.
Absolutely. I have one question about the future. This might be a good way to wrap up the presentation since we only have about 8 minutes left. Is there something about current or future work, disability work, that you see happening or that you want to see happen that hasn't happened yet?
So I think we all understand, for example, that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 has still not been realized as it intentionally we were hoping would happen. Things like voting rights, we're actually seeing in many states repression around voting. And I think, as a disabled person, I am very concerned about the difficulty that disabled people in normal situations where there wasn't all this focus on setting up barriers to enable people to vote, how that will have an adverse effect on disabled people of color, disabled people who are poor, disabled people of different ages, different languages. And so these types of issues are of deep concern to me. I really find, looking broader than disability, that the absence of people's knowledge about who are our elected representatives, why is it important that we pay attention to every person running for every position, whether it's school board or library districts, which I didn't even know until I was talking with Pillars that there are library districts in some cases. Who are the people that are running? Should you be considering running? Or people, who come to the library, do they understand? Do they understand what a state judge is and what the process is for identifying and screening and selecting a state judge or a federal judge or the Supreme Court? I think people don't really understand this. And in too many cases, they're either not voting or not knowledgeably voting for the people in all positions that are running. I mean, I can certainly say for myself that there have been times when I've gone into the voting booth and I don't really know the positions that someone has. When I lived in California, they had a really good system where you got a voter guide, and the voter guide gave you information supporting and opposing all the people that were running for office. In DC, to the best of my knowledge, we don't have that. So, when I go into a voting booth, if I don't necessarily know about a particular position, I'm not going to be able to find anything out there. So knowing your rights, knowing why it's important to vote, being nonpartisan, obviously, I think that's very important, that we have to be nonpartisan, and clearly librarians and libraries need to be nonpartisan, but that doesn't take away the importance of, as we discussed earlier, the right for people to read literature that we may not all want to read or we may not all agree with, which is one of the importance of a democracy, is to be able to read things that other people may not, see as valuable, and being able to debate it. In the disability community perspective, there are many things. It's really continuing to allow people with disabilities, visible and in particular invisible disabilities, to understand what laws are out there to protect them. People do not know enough about what their rights are. And now I'm not just singling out disabled people, but certainly disabled people. So helping people learn about what their rights are, I think, is important. I think, for me, really getting the media much more involved in appropriately representing disabled people, in ads, in magazines, in newspapers, in social media, in television and movies. It's happening a little bit more, but I think it's happening much more in other categories like racial diversity, sexual orientation, gender. In disability, it's still happening more, but not enough, and not being recognized enough. So I think, really one of the important roles of libraries is to do your very best to have literature that's out there on the shelves and however else people can get it, which allows people to read the stories and learn about disabled people in their lives, but also learn about research that's going on. Oh, I mean, I don't need to tell you, you know much more than I do, but it's really normalizing disability, which will ultimately really enhance all of our communities. And I think libraries are one of many, but one very pivotal part of how the knowledge can be gathered and disseminated.
I completely agree with that. We both have a responsibility and a duty to share in terms of representing disability, all our patrons, and meeting them where they are. And I think we can be role models in terms of highlighting these issues as well in libraries.
I mean,
Well,
I think none of you feel prouder than if someone that you had coming to the library when they were younger come back and say, I'm a librarian because of you.
yes, I think that's a really nice moment to have, or even when they just come back because they love the book that you recommended. and want
Exactly.
more. Even that is really nice.
And I just want to say on the recommending of books, being on top of the books that are out there, giving more visibility to books that are being written by disabled people and parents and things, I think is really valuable. Getting bookstores more involved to let them know the books that are available.
Yeah, there's so many more titles out there than the ones that get highlighted and popular really quickly that librarians can feature instead of just the usual titles.
Yep.
Well, it is 2:59. We're at the end of the hour. I want to thank Judy. Thank you so much for a great discussion. It was a pleasure speaking with you, and thank you for taking the time to be here today.
And thank you all. Thank you.
And I want to thank all of our attendees as well for taking the time to be here with us all day and making this symposium the success that it is. And our presenters who had great presentations, thank you so much for taking the time to present.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Carolyn.
Yeah, I appreciate you spending the time with us today.
Can't hear you.
Everybody else who's been here. So just want to wish everybody, a happy day and be well and be safe.
We're very quiet, Carolyn.
I know.
The mic isn't on or something.
Oh.
Go.
This is a good reason to learn sign language, right?
Yes.
We should all learn sign language in case we have a technical difficulty, as I
Now
did
you're
just
very
now.
clear.
Forgot why do my ears feel so good? Because I took the headset off, but nobody can hear me. Sorry about that. I was just saying thank you, and I hope everybody has a great day and stay healthy and safe out there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hope we can stay in touch.
Definitely.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Now's the hard part because we have to end the webinar, which always feels like you're sending everybody into the
I know.
far reaches, but we're gonna have to press the button.
Yeah.
Bye.